Hi there. Thank you, Michael. My name is Alex. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm trans and genderqueer. And I've spent the last 4 years researching the theological and anthropological understandings of 10 trans and non-binary people. And I'm going to share my screen now as I speak with you about that. A key point of learning for me has been the timely reminder that trans and non binary people are beginning to assert a narrative formed by euphoria against the trope of dysphoria. Framing all trans related theology around dysphoria, which is what has happened so far, and which is the distress that trans folks experience, risks a really clouded lens of suffering and normativity, whereas euphoria has the potential to be a language of justice and of hope. So Bishel and all explain that gender euphoria describes a joyful feeling of rightness in one's sex or gender, and go on to argue that it is essential that clinicians and gender theorists understand and use this relatively new grassroots term. This move, they say, would fundamentally shift the discourse of trans-related theology to move the focus from dysphoria and suffering, along with necessitated resilience, to euphoria and joy. On a personal level, I've come to realize that I have been consenting to my own objectification by co-opting the language of suffering, of medicalization, and of resilience that is assumed and often enforced by the cis-normative majority. Until interviewing one of my research participants, whose narrative had a profound effect on my understandings, I had never considered my own identity through the lens of euphoria or joy, always through the lens of suffering instead. I'm now reframing my own narrative, co-creating new language with my trans and non-binary peers, instead of passively using the language of the oppressor. One of my PhD interview participants, Jackson, explained that I can only say that I've been led by the idea of gender euphoria and what feels right, what feels congruent with who I am, internally, externally, psychologically, and emotionally. I guess I've come at it from a very individual experience of my own journey, Jackson says. Jackson went on to say that his transition has been about following breadcrumbs of delight. How might Jackson's narrative and others like it be honored in theologies and anthropologies? Two writers who have influenced my thinking on euphoria are Nadia Bolz-Weber and Marcella Althus-Reid. Despite Bolz-Weber's own suffering, her writing often focuses on the ways in which she has been able to expand her theological understandings. Her text, Shameless, is particularly helpful here. Bolz-Weber unpicks piece by piece narratives of shame and suffering and offers in response narratives, theological insights, and ecclesial practices of embodied euphoria. Marcella Althus-Reid's writing, though, helps me to take a further step because she challenges a theological focus on suffering, which she suggests is inevitable in systematic theologies. In her seminal text, Indecent Theology, Marcella calls out the dangerous practice of sacralizing oppression. In other words, she said, it is both risky, theologically and practically, to make oppression into an idol and thereby excuse inaction by the church. Althus-Reid suggests that systematic theological production has traditionally made reflection on human suffering its object of exchange, her thesis being that incoherence is the only appropriate mitigation. Euphoria is an incoherent frame, which rejects the positioning of suffering as the only position from which a trans person can express themselves or defend their humanity. A nuanced framing of euphoria, which resists totalizing coherence, must be authentic, theological, practical, and motional. So firstly, authentic. An authentic narrative of euphoria acknowledges the fullness of trans lives, focusing not only on joy, but also on complexity, challenge, and frankly, the mundanity of daily life. Secondly, a theological narrative of euphoria points out the ways in which trans folks mirror God and are full and vital parts of the body of Christ. Thirdly, a practical narrative of euphoria does not assume that our work is done, but rather supports trans folks and our allies to continue the long process of organizing and taking action to move towards dignity, justice, and safety for all trans people. And fourthly, a emotional narrative of euphoria does not create new hegemony, but is instead always moving towards the other and towards the future, recognizing that change is both a constant and a good. I would like to come towards an end with another quote from Jackson, which highlights the importance of trans theology. Jackson said that there's so much that the church could learn from a trans lens on theology. There's a real liberty that comes when you start to unpick gender, because gender has become so informative of how we live our lives. Once you start to look at trans perspectives, the binaries start to fall apart. It fundamentally disrupts hierarchical ordering. So many binary obsessions fall apart. It really starts to break down a lot of stuff. And so it is these words from Jackson that convince me that a framing of trans euphoria, which prioritizes authenticity, trans theologizing, practical action, and emotional change, has the capacity to bring us closer to God's world of justice and peace. May it be so. Thank you.
Personally, your topic about gender transition and non-binary teaches me a lot in terms of rethink gender transition in delight. So even in South Korea society, the issue of LGBTQIA plus, the people in the church are ignored to treat with the congregation. So it is subtle on the people's concerning, particularly the younger generations. They have a lot of question about the LGBTQI, but they keep quiet in the church. So because it is very heavy, as you know, this is very heavy and banded issues in the church. So that's why they don't want to talk about uncovering the issues of LGBT in the church. So, and even as you mentioned, the fundamental theology. So because of the fundamental theologians and the fundamental pastors in South Korea churches, they define the LGBTQI people. QI, the issues is very thin and the sinners like that. So, and I'm living in this circumstance, and also we do not have much of education about the LGBTQI this context, these issues in seminary, even in society as well. So so that's why, and I discovered your point. You brought your gender transition experiences from your experience, reality experience, into the academic field. This is very valuable, I think. So, and also, I'm very glad to discover your approach with using the joyful. With the joyful understanding. A joyful understanding of these issues. It is very impressive to me. Yes. And then, and then one of the question I have is I know that before we spotlight section, we already talk about the conceptualization of gender and sex, and also I have a question that how can we justify the gender or the sex and the rule of gender and sex in the Christianity, even in the theology, then. Identifying what is the gender and what is the sex. So this is my question.
I think I heard a question around the distinction between how we identify sex and how we identify gender in the Bible. And I think it's really complex because I think often when people are talking about trans identities, they assume or think that trans people want a separation of gender and sex, that by transitioning we're saying our gender is different than our sex. But I'm really aware that sex is so understudied, and that a lot of trans people experience that we have sex differences. So a lot of us fall into intersex categories. And that by transitioning, we are altering both sex and gender in really complexly interrelated ways. For me, talking about this in terms of the Bible always comes back to Genesis. And I think in Genesis, where it talks about what could be described as either sex or gender, it's been very much kind of made into a binary in English translations, but in Hebrew, it can just as well read something like God created them from masculine to feminine. And that to me expresses the complexity and nuance of sex and gender a lot better than most of our cultural ways of talking about it. So I think the Bible can actually help us to be more liberative for trans people, but only if we go back to source texts and don't rely on basically English missionary translations.